In almost every ancient case, we're dealing with probabilities, we're dealing with converging lines of evidence, we're dealing with reasonable judgment about how close a source is to the event that it describes. So the question with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's not are they perfect? The question is, how close were they to the people who were actually there? If you scroll through TikTok or YouTube long enough, you would eventually hear something like this. The church hid the real gospels. Oh, what about the Gospel of Thomas? Or there were dozens of competing Christianities and the most powerful one won and burned all the rest. Well, that's a compelling story. It feels dramatic. It feels like it makes you think that you've uncovered a secret that ordinary Christians were not supposed to know. But here's a question we have to ask. Is Christianity actually built on edited and censored documents that have been carefully curated to support a version of Jesus and suppress all the rest? In this episode, we're going to put those claims on the table. We're going to talk about the so-called lost gospels and why some books ended up in the Bible and others did not. Whether the texts of the Bible themselves have been changed or corrupted along the way. The core question is simple. Can we trust the texts that we have today? Welcome back to Align Podcast, and let's get on this together. This episode is titled, Have the Gospels Been Changed or Corrupted? Let's start with the phrase that you've probably heard before. Lost Gospels. What are they actually talking about when they say lost Gospels? See, when people say the lost Gospels, they're referring to the later writings that use the name of Jesus or one of the other apostles. Things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas. That actually debunks itself. The Gospel of Peter, and a handful of other writings here and there. They often show up in documentary with dramatic music and titles like The Forbidden Bible. These texts are interesting and they give us a window into what some groups were thinking about Jesus a century or more later. See, we have to be careful here. The term interesting and the term earliest, most reliable sources are not the same thing. One important point right away is that the mere fact that there are multiple writings about Jesus does not automatically mean the earlier stories was completely different. Let's break this down. A lot of people hear the term, there were many gospels, and they jump to the idea that so the original stories must have been totally different and later Christians edited it into what we have now. But that conclusion does not follow the evidence, and here's why. First, multiple accounts don't equal multiple different stories. In history, when you have several writings about the same person, that doesn't mean each one invents a new version of them. It often means that the story was important enough to be told and retold. Think about Abraham Lincoln, for example. There are many biographies of him. That doesn't mean the earliest one said he was a farmer who never became a president, and the later books turned him into a president. They differ in focus and details, but they are working from the same core facts. Secondly, we can actually check what the earliest message was. See, the New Testament itself preserves very early materials. We're talking about creeds and hymns and summaries of beliefs that predates the writing of the Gospels themselves. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul quotes a statement about Jesus' death and his resurrection that scholars date to just a few years after the crucifixion. That shows the core story, Jesus died and rose again. That core story was already fixed years before. So when later writings say something different, the question becomes, are they preserving the story of Jesus or are they reworking the story of Jesus? Finally, diversity that shows up later does not prove that there was chaos at the beginning. You can have unity at the beginning and variations later. In fact, historically, that's often what happens. A core tradition forms, it spreads widely, and then alternative interpretations emerge. So diversity in later texts doesn't mean that the original message was vague or endlessly flexible. What it can mean is that people started experimenting with it afterwards. The earliest sources we can trace, Paul's letter, early creeds, the synoptic gospels, they all line up to these main points. Jesus was a historically real person. He taught publicly. He was crucified. His followers believed that he rose from the dead and they worship him as Lord. So yes, there are multiple writings about Jesus, but when you look at the earliest layers of evidence, they're not pointing to a completely different Jesus. They're circling around the same story. So, the mere fact that there are multiple writings about Jesus does not automatically mean that the earliest story was completely different. In other words, having many writings about Jesus does not mean that the original story was lost. It means that the story was important enough to be written down more than once. The evidence of later fan fiction about a historical figure doesn't erase the value of the earlier biographies. So the real question is not, are there other writings about Jesus? Are there other writings that mention Jesus? Of course there are. The real question is this: how do these later texts compare to the four Gospels in terms of age, connection to eyewitnesses, and continuity with what the first Christians were actually preaching? So next time when you hear the lost Gospels, I encourage you to probe it. Ask the questions. How do these lost Gospels stand up when compared with the four Gospels in terms of age, connection to eyewitnesses, and continuity with what the first Christians were actually preaching? So now let's take a look at how some books ended up in the Bible and others didn't. Was it just politics, power, or suppression at work? See, the early Christians actually used a pretty consistent instinct when they recognized certain writings as scripture, and they used those same instincts to set some aside. You can think of these instincts as sort of questions, three big questions they asked, formally and informally, not because they were trying to be gatekeepers, but because they were trying to protect the truth about Jesus. And those same three questions, we could still apply them today in our own life. The first question focuses on apostolic connection. Is this writing connected to an apostle or to someone in their close circle? In other words, does it go back to the people who actually walked with Jesus or learned directly from those who did? The second question is about early widespread use. Has this book been read, copied, and used in churches across different regions from early on, or did it suddenly just appear in a smaller group somewhere? And the third question pertains to consistency with the earliest preaching. Does this text line up with what the first Christians already were proclaiming about Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection? Or does it introduce a completely different message that looks more like a later philosophy dressed up as Christian stories with Christian names? When you apply those kind of instincts to the Gospels, to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these books rise to the very top. These books are anchored in first century. They are tied to apostolic circle, and they show up early and were widely used in Christian worship and teachings. Let's talk a little bit about the apostolic connection. This mattered because in the ancient world, apostles weren't just religious teachers, they were eyewitnesses. They heard Jesus teach, they saw what he did, they watched him die, and they believed they saw him again. In a world without printing press or mass literacy, personal connection mattered. If a writing could be traced back to Peter or Paul or John, or to people closely connected to them like Mark and Luke, this story carried weight. If it couldn't carry weight, it raised a different question. This wasn't about power. It was about proximity to the event. And here's why apostolic connection matters, because apostolic connection reminds us that Christianity is not built on vague spiritual ideas. It is built on histories of testimonies of real people in real places about real events. Let's talk about the early widespread use. This also mattered in ancient time because it protected the church from fringe ideas and from people claiming to have experienced Jesus in ways that were not true. And it matters to us today because we are living in a time when people get a whiff of personal opinion and they propagate those personal opinions as facts. The early church typically cross-checked, was this manuscript, this letter, this book being read, was it used across many churches, or did it suddenly appear in much smaller groups later on? So if a writing was being read in, say, Rome, in Antioch, in Alexandria, or even in Jerusalem, it was typically copied again, and then used in worship and teachings. This action showed that it wasn't just someone's private project. It meant that churches in different regions were recognizing the same core writings independently. But if a book only showed up much later and only in one small movement, that in itself raised a different kind of question. Not is it interesting, but where did this come from? Early and widespread use reminds us that the New Testament was not chosen at random. It grew out of what Christians were already reading everywhere. Now let's talk about consistency with the earlier preaching. The question here is, does this text line up with what the first Christians already were saying about Jesus? Does it line up with his life, his death, and his resurrection? Or does it introduce something completely different about Jesus? Before there was a New Testament collection, there was already preachings, there were already hymns, there were already confession of faith, there were already creeds. And the message was simple and it was steady. Jesus lived, Jesus died, Jesus rose, and Jesus is Lord. So when a new text appeared, Christians asked the questions, does this sound like the same Jesus we've been talking about? And that still matters today because we see new versions of Jesus springing up all the time. A Jesus without a cross, a Jesus without resurrection, a Jesus that just affirms whatever it is that we already believe. Consistency reminds us that Christianity has a historical core. Not every new version of Jesus is the real one. These three questions were not about control, they were about continuity, continuing what has already been. By contrast, right, something like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas shows up much later in more limited circles, and they often presented very different kinds of Jesus, more like a secret knowledge teaching than the crucified and risen Lord that we see in the earliest preachings. That doesn't mean that these later texts are worthless as historical artifacts, but it does mean that they were never serious contenders for the core story of Jesus in the mainstream Christian movements. The idea that some council in the 4th century just chopped them out to hide the real Christianity makes for great internet content, but it doesn't match how these books were actually viewed on the ground. In other words, the books that made it into the New Testament weren't chosen because they were convenient. They were recognized because they were already at the heart of what Christians were reading and preaching from the beginning. Okay, but even if we say fine, these 4 Gospels are the main story, another question that often comes up is, have they been changed? You might hear someone say, oh, the Bible has been translated and retranslated so many times, and we have no idea what it originally said. Here's the reality. We don't have the original sheets of papyrus that Matthew or Mark wrote on, and that's a fact. What we do have are the thousands of handwritten copies in different languages from different places and different centuries. And because scribes were humans, there are differences between those copies and the actual copies. Those are called textual variants. That might sound scary at first, but think about it this way. If you only had one old copy, you have no way to cross-check it. Having many copies means that you can compare them, spot where a scribe misspelled a word, dropped a line, or added a little note, and that later got copied as if it were part of the original text. For instance, imagine this. At year 50, a letter is written and sent to a church. That original copy is read out aloud and then copied by hand so that other churches can have it. Year 80 comes around, and now there are maybe 20 handwritten copies circulating. One scribe accidentally skips a line. Another scribe misspells a word. A third scribe adds a small note in the margins like, this means Jesus is Lord. And later, someone copies that note into the text by mistake. Now you have copy A that has a missing line. You have copy B that has the same line but with a misspelled word. And you have copy C with the same line plus an extra phrase. Fast forward to year 200. Now there are hundreds of copies across different regions in Rome, in Africa, in Asia Minor, in Syria, and most of them still read the same way, but a few have small differences. Here is the key point. Because you have many copies, you can compare them and you can see, okay, 95% of them say this, and only two late ones say that this is this. This longer version appears at maybe year 150. So you can tell where a scribe mistakenly spells a word. You can tell where a note was accidentally added. And you can tell what the earlier version or the earliest version was like. Now imagine the opposite. If you had only one copy from year 200, you have no way to tell if a line was dropped. You have no way to tell if a word was changed, or if a comment was added, or if that copy was even faithful to the original text. You'll be stuck. One copy says this, and that's all we got. No comparison, no cross-checking, no error detection. The point is, having many manuscripts doesn't make the text less reliable. It actually makes it more testable. More copies equals more chances to compare, more abilities to spot mistakes when and if they arise. So what sounds scary at first is actually what lets scholars say this is probably the original wording, because it appears in the earliest and widest range of copies. When you put all of this together, what you get is not a picture of a widely unstable text that has been rewritten every few decades. What you get is a text where you can say with a very high degree of confidence, we know what the authors wrote in all the places that matters for the basic story of Jesus. Who he was, what he taught, what he did, how he died, and what the earliest Christians claimed happened afterwards. So yes, there are variants, and no, that does not mean the story has been hopelessly corrupted. It actually means that we can see the process and not just guesswork in operation. The last piece of this puzzle is timing. How early are the Gospels? If the Gospels were written 200 or 300 years after Jesus, then the legends theory would make more sense. That in itself would have given it plenty of time for stories to grow, for miracles to be added, and for simple teachers to be turned into a divine figure. But that's not the picture we get. The Gospels were written within the lifetime of people who could still remember Jesus, or at least remember the generation that did. They are first century documents, not distant, hazy recollections from centuries later. These matter because legends usually need time to build, time for memories to blur, time for stories to be retold, time for embellishment to happen without anyone saying, hold up, hold up, hold up. That's not actually what happened. The events of Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, and resurrection happened around AD 30 to 33. Most historians agree that the Gospels were written in this order. Mark was first written approximately around AD 60 to 70. That means that Mark was likely written about 30 to 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. This is within the lifetime of the apostles, eyewitnesses, and people who personally knew them. This was not a long, legendary time in the ancient world. It was still within living memory. Matthew and Luke were written next, approximately AD 70 to 85. They were probably written about 40 to 55 years after the event. Luke actually explicitly stated it that he used eyewitness testimonies, and you can see this in Luke chapter 1, from verse 1. At this point in history, the story of Jesus had already been preached for decades. Churches across the Roman world already knew the core of the message. These Gospels at this time were preserving what had already been taught. John was written last. It was written approximately AD 85 to 95. This still places it within 50 to 65 years after the event. This is not centuries later. It's still within eyewitness testimony, still within a generation that lived and experienced life with Jesus. I say all of this to say, when a movement starts proclaiming a crucified and risen Messiah within a few years of his death, and when written accounts follow within living memory, we're not dealing with the same kind of situation as a myth that slowly evolves over half a millennium. None of this by itself proves that every miracle happened exactly as described, but it does mean this. You cannot simply wave the gospel away as a late, corrupt, legendary creation and call that a serious historical argument. The timeline is too tight and the evidence is too stubborn to go away. So, where does that leave us? We've seen that there are other writings about Jesus, but that the four Gospels stand out in terms of age and connection to the earliest Christian preachings. We've seen that the text has variants, but not the kind of radical corruption that would erase the core story. And we've seen that these books were written much earlier than the centuries of legends that story normally suggests. Well, now that raises a new kind of question. What kind of writings are these? Are they history, biographies, or just religious storytelling and myths? That's where we're headed next. In the next episode, we'll ask, are the Gospels history or just religious stories? And we'll dig into what different kind of literature they actually are. As we close, I want to bring this question back to you in another way. If the Gospels haven't been radically corrupted over time, if they were not chosen by a late conspiracy that buried dozens of equally early, equally valid accounts, if they were written within living memory of Jesus by or through people who were close to the events, then what does that do to your trust or distrust of their story? It may not suddenly make you a Christian. It may not resolve every tension you feel, but it does undercut some of the easy reasons we use to avoid taking the gospel seriously. My invitation is simple. If some of those objections are weaker than you thought, are you willing to let the gospel speak for themselves and wrestle with what they say about Jesus? If this episode stirred any questions, objections, or even anger, I'd love to hear from you. Send in your questions. I'll do my best to address them in future episodes or Q&A conversations. Thank you for listening to Online Podcast. Cheers.